Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, August 30th, 2021, and on this episode, I've got a somewhat detailed introduction to the preamble to the Constitution for the United States. I'm going to share a little information about preambles in general, like what is a preamble, how the preamble to the Constitution came about in the Philadelphia Convention. It didn't start out with one, and it took a couple of months before they even got to it. There was really no opposition to it at the Philadelphia Convention, but there was some complaints, Patrick Henry and others, Brutus, the anti-federalist writer, during the ratification debates. I'm also going to highlight the 6 purposes of the preamble, and then when we're reading it in whole, we can actually learn 3 foundational principles that the founders and the framers had about the Constitution from the text of the preamble itself. Well, I hope you guys find this interesting stuff, but first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's got all the archives for over 3 years. On individual episodes like this one today, I'm going to link to the source documents and articles that I cite in this episode so you can read and learn more on your own time, because I'm just going to be scratching the surface in 30 plus minutes. There's a lot of info on this. You can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and Twitch, but we're also live streaming at Odyssey.com, which is awesome. We archive the video over at Gab TV, Rumble, Minds, sometimes MeWe. They've got some file size limitations. Brighteon, BitChute, Hyper, BitTube. We're all over the place. Even Instagram, sometimes LinkedIn. And then we have the audio-only podcast edition on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, all over the place. And you can even find our membership program for as little as $2 a month. You can put your financial faith behind our work, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. Again, that show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while we allow people another moment or so to get notifications to join us out on the live stream, I want to say a quick hello to everyone in the live chat. There's Reason and Rights over on Periscope and Twitter. Thanks for being here. Christy and Joe Brady, Walt, Joe, and Sharon over on Facebook. Voodoo Queen, Dave, Melissa Harrell, Merkin Muffy, Patricia Dance, Cheriton, Bob Landry, Tim Martin, Dwayne, Richard over on YouTube, Clay Kent. I think I mentioned Walt, but Walt, hello again. I appreciate you all being here. Let's get right to this. We got a ton of information to share, and I don't want to keep you too long, but I'll do my best to get this out to you as quickly as possible and concisely, because we got to cover the info. Let's start out with this overview from an article that we just published in the last couple of weeks by Rob Natelson, Understanding the Constitution, the Style of the Preamble. Of course, I will link to this in the show notes with everything else. And he starts it out like this. The Constitution begins with an introduction called the preamble, a word from the Latin, and my Latin is terrible, so I'm going to destroy this. Preambulus. Maybe I've got that okay. Preambulus, meaning walking before. The preamble to a legal instrument identifies the parties, states crucial facts, and or explains the purpose of a document. Now, if you've seen state or local legislation, you've often seen a bunch of whereas clauses at the beginning. And Rob points out that whereas clauses appearing in some documents are also preambles. So we're learning that a preamble is it's kind of an introduction, like an overview to a book or an important legal document. And here he goes again in another article that we just published this morning. He cites Edward Coke. He says the 17th century legal scholar whose writings were at the core of the founders' legal education, one of the lead ones, said that a preamble is a, quote, key to the minds of the makers. So a preamble is there so you understand why that document exists. It's kind of explanatory of what they're trying to do, maybe some goals that they're trying to accomplish. And even the Supreme Court, and I don't really like citing the Supreme Court because a lot of people take that to mean that we're looking to the Supreme Court to tell us what the Constitution means. No. Sometimes the Supreme Court gets it right, sometimes they get it wrong, and it's good to cite them when they validate what the Constitution, what the law is supposed to mean. And Rob puts that in as well. He says, as a Supreme Court, he didn't say it in that way, but as a Supreme Court noted in Jacobson versus Massachusetts, 1905, which you may hear about quite a bit recently, or pay attention to that one for current events today. But in that one, the court said that a preamble is not a source of binding rules. It's not there to grant, take away, give, delegate, do anything to add power to the document. It is there to shed light on the rules found elsewhere in the document. If you understand the motivation for why, and in fact, if we look at what we're doing here in our work, when we talk about the revolution and where the founders learned things from, like Montesquieu and Algernon Sidney and Cato's letters in the early 1720s, when we want to understand why they did things, it's because they learned from history. And the more that we understand their motivation, the more it makes sense as to what they did with the document itself. And that's the Supreme Court, surprisingly, nailed that one here. And here's James Madison talking about preambles generally. Here's the guy, father of the Constitution. I think that probably more rightly, that name rightly belongs with James Wilson or maybe even Gouverneur Morris, but they're all very influential. Here's James Madison in the Report of 1800, explaining the Virginia resolutions of 1798 against the hated Alien and Sedition Acts. And he's talking about how some people were claiming that the federal government could enact those so-called laws under the preamble. And he's saying this is nuts. And he explains why. A preamble, he didn't say this is nuts. That's my version of it. And that's why Madison was much smarter than me. A preamble usually contains the general motives or reasons for the particular regulations or measures which follow it, and is always understood to be explained and limited by them. He goes on, he says, in the present instance, when people were trying to argue that the preamble was delegating to the federal government, here it is just years out of the gate. If you watched my episode about when things went off the rails, we know that they really started going off the rails literally within the first few months. And then I cited 1791 as the big year where things were no longer on the constitutional track. But here, just a few years later, people were making the case that using the preamble, you could delegate to the power more control over free speech, for example. And he says, in the present instance, a contrary interpretation would have an inadmissible effect, using the preamble to grant the federal government more power, of rendering nugatory or improper every part of the Constitution which succeeds the preamble. So the preamble was there to explain, according to James Madison, the general motives or reasons for what follows in the document itself. And we can go here to, of course, odd place. I don't use this as a place to cite information, but it was really well done here, constitution.congress.gov. And here at Congress, they put it this way. For the first 2 months of the convention, if we're looking where this came, there was no proposal to include a preamble in the Constitution's text. It wasn't even a consideration. They were more debating kind of the general structure, the Virginia plan, where the federal government would have, for example, a veto power over the states, and they rejected that. But by late July 1787, the convention's Committee of Detail was formed to prepare a draft of a constitution. And during those deliberations, committee member Edmund Randolph, who was a pretty well-known guy, he also made the argument, one of the three big arguments along with Jefferson and Madison against the formation of the first bank, the First National Bank of the United States in 1791, even though George Washington and Hamilton ignored him. But side note, Edmund Randolph of Virginia suggested for the first time that, quote, a preamble seems proper. Now, he didn't want to make it a big, grandiose thing, and that's what they say here at congress.gov. Importantly, however, Randolph considered the Constitution to be a legal as opposed to a philosophical document. And you may have heard me talk like this, talking about how the Constitution is an 18th century legal document. And if we want, just like any legal document, if we want to understand the legal meaning of the words or the phrases in that document, we have to understand what the people understood it to mean at the time they gave it legal force. And that's why we put less emphasis on the Philadelphia Convention, the intention of the framers, and far more emphasis on what the people believed they were ratifying in the state ratifying conventions. Side note. Anyways, Randolph considered the Constitution to be a legal and not just a philosophical document, and rejected the idea of having a lengthy, quote, display of theory to explain the ends of government and human politics akin to the Declaration of Independence's preamble or those of several state constitutions. So the first draft of the preamble came out on August 6th, 1787. That's when the Committee of Detail submitted it. And it began, it's so much different. If you know, and I'll read the text of it in just a few minutes, the current preamble to the Constitution for the United States. But the first draft of it, which came out of, I don't know for sure if it was Edmund Randolph leading the effort on this, but he certainly was part of this. And it actually listed the states. It said this: "We, the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, do ordain, declare, and establish the following Constitution for the government of ourselves and our posterity." So they're reaffirming that we had these independent sovereign nations, which the king recognized as being free and independent states at some point there, especially if you're thinking about the Treaty of Paris and the Declaration of Independence. We had 13 independent sovereign nations that were coming together in a union for very limited general purposes. And this actually reaffirmed that. It made it very clear that it was the people of the several states that were coming together here. Although there was some confusion over time that if you just listed the states, would that actually say that the state governments were forming the Constitution? And there was some complaint about that. Anyways, that actually didn't end up being the final version. And on September 8th, 1787, we're getting close to the end of the convention. Most of the debates were almost done. We know September 17th is known as Constitution Day. That was the day that at the beginning of the Philadelphia Convention, Benjamin Franklin rose, gave this speech about how he opposed parts of it. He didn't like parts of the Constitution, but thought that they should send it to the states for ratification anyways. But just a few days before that, September 8th, 1787. So this kind of proposal with "we the people of the states" was in there. Then they sent it to the Committee of Style. And here, this is actually from the debate notes in the convention. A committee was then appointed by ballot to revise the style of and arrange the articles which had been agreed to by the House. The committee consisted of Mr. Johnson. I forget his first name, but he was actually the chair of that committee. Mr. Hamilton, who we don't like, Mr. Governor Morris, Mr. Madison, and Mr. King. Now, Johnson actually recommended, even though he was chair, that Morris lead the effort on this. So he actually did a lot of work on the final drafting of basically all the stuff that they had debated and said, okay, we're going to go with this, we're rejecting that, let's go with the notes. And this Committee of Style, the final rewrite, was heavily done by Governor Morris. And that's how Nadelson put it. He said Governor Morris was the principal author. Now, his first name is actually the last name of someone, I think, on his mother's side. It's an interesting history there. Governor Morris was the principal author of the Constitution's final draft, which started September 8th, September 9th in that Committee of Style. Morris lived in New York State, but he was visiting Philadelphia when the convention was about to meet. And Pennsylvanians were so impressed, Rob writes, that they chose him as one of their convention delegates, even though he was out of state. Pennsylvanians were like that. A few years previously, they had tapped John Dickinson to be president of their state at the very time when Dickinson was serving as president of Delaware. So he actually had a dual title. And Rob puts it this way. The Constitution is a grand and important document. So Morris labored to give it grandeur and gravity. His preamble that he drafted, we give him credit. We don't actually know. We don't actually have any detailed records of what happened September 8th through, I guess, September 17th in that Committee of Style. We don't have those records. We don't know if there was debate or opposition. We have no idea. But we actually give him credit. No one seemed to have debated that over the years. And this is the final version that we have today. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, don't forget, the United States was always considered plural. It was these United States that they often referred to it as. This wasn't United States as one singular blob. And here again from Congress.gov, They say the record from the Philadelphia Convention is silent, however, as to why the Committee of Style altered the preamble. We have some kind of inclinations, and Mike Meharry, I'm going to cite an article from him that gets to kind of the heart of that, which most people tend to agree on, but we don't know for sure. It is silent as to why the Committee of Style altered the preamble from "we the people of these states" to "we the people." And there is no evidence of any objection to the changes the committee made to the final version of the preamble. I would add the caveat, there is no evidence in the Philadelphia Convention. I know they say that at the beginning of the sentence, but just in case, because there was absolutely some opposition. I think Patrick Henry was the most forceful on this. In fact, when Patrick Henry supported or opposed something at the time, he was generally the most forceful. Maybe Theophilus Parsons was another biggie up in Massachusetts. But here's how Patrick Henry put it. This was, he had 2 times, I think it was June 4th and June 5th, or June 5th, June 6th, basically back to back, where he's referencing and kind of railing on this notion of "we the people." And he puts it this way in his first of these 2 speeches. He says, "I have the highest veneration for those gentlemen," talking about the people in the Philadelphia Convention. He's not attacking their character, but he says, "But sir, give me leave to demand, what right had they to say, we the people? My political curiosity, exclusive of my anxious solicitude for the public welfare, leads me to ask, who authorized to speak the language of we the people instead of we the states?" Now, Patrick Henry wasn't in that Philadelphia Convention, but we the states certainly was right off the bat with Randolph's version, another Virginian. Now, Randolph wasn't necessarily on board with the Constitution like Henry, but for far different reasons. I think they were opposite ends of the spectrum. But again, here we are. He's asking, why does it say "we the people"? And here's Brutus, the great anti-federalist writer, which I cover pretty often, from his 12th paper, which I'll get to in some detail in the near future if you've been following this. He said, Brutus noticed, he made references to a more perfect union and the establishment of justice in that. And he argued, and again, if you followed my episodes on Brutus's writings, this is most likely John Williams of New York, great anti-federalist up there. A lot of people thought it was Robert Yates in the past, maybe Melancton Smith, most likely John Williams. And Williams was very clear in that he recognized over and over when he was making a case against something in the Constitution, he was acknowledging that the legal backing behind the case he was making was most likely incorrect. And he was trusting the people who were saying, well, no, this is something different. In fact, those of you who cite Lysander Spooner, Spooner in his great 1870, the appendix to his 1870 writing of the book No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, which a lot of ANCAPs like to cite as if the Constitution has failed to do what it is supposed to do, even though it requires something outside the document to enforce itself. Anyways, Spooner was also making that same case when he said, the Constitution either caused this or didn't, or failed to prevent what we live under. And he was even saying, I know that it doesn't authorize, based on the legal principles, it doesn't authorize what they're doing. But we still have a problem because they're doing it anyways. And Brutus was making that case over and over some decades earlier in 1787 and 1788, where he's saying, I know how it's supposed to be, but let's think about human nature and practice. I think this text will lead to this. And in many situations, he was incorrect. In many of them, he was correct. Sometimes it happened faster or slower. But here he was arguing that these phrases, more perfect union and establishment of justice, would result in the invalidation of state laws that interfered with these national objectives. It's kind of played out like that right now, or in recent decades, and resulting in the abolition of all inferior governments. Now, we see them in practice, and I think in many ways, Brutus may have been wrong about how it was going to play out, but right in the end result. We have basically states and counties all acting as political subdivisions of the central government. And he thought it would give one complete legislative, executive, and judicial power to every purpose. Basically, one all-powerful central government. Now, James Wilson responded to this type of a viewpoint, not just from Brutus, but from others who were complaining about we the people. This was in the Pennsylvania ratifying convention. I get those confused. November 28th, 1787. And he starts out making this point. He says, this will be a proper time for making an observation or two on what may be called the preamble to this Constitution. And they use the word this Constitution in the preamble as well, so I wonder if that was intentional. He says, I had occasion on a former day to mention that the leading principle in the politics and that which pervades the American constitutions is that the supreme power resides in the people. Now, if we understand the history of what the founding generation went through, the old revolutionaries, they lived under a system where the king was sovereign. Sovereignty meant final authority. So if doesn't matter what you thought, what you had on paper, if the king said it meant this, then the king was correct. And under the American system, the way it's supposed to be, the people don't act like this, not even close today, but the way it's supposed to be is that the people hold final authority, hold sovereignty. And this we the people, is an affirmation of that view. We'll get to the point of whether that means we the people as a whole or we the people of these various states. Wilson goes on, he says, the Constitution is announced in their name. It receives its political existence from their authority. They ordain and establish. What is the necessary consequence? Those who ordain and establish have the power, if they think proper, to repeal and annul. So he's basically reiterating the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So a government can be altered or abolished, right? And if you're saying the people are the final authority and reasserting that in the Constitution for the United States, they're saying, well, at the end of the day, whatever the government may have to say, the people hold that final authority. And if they think it's proper, they can repeal or annul that. And you hear a lot of that in the state ratifying conventions as well. He says it renders this truth evident, this is again James Wilson, that the people have a right to do what they please with regard to the government. We don't need no stinking permission. That's going to be the title of a speech that I'm giving in October 2nd in Fairfax, Virginia, so maybe that's what I'll put in there as well. The people have a right to do what they please with regard to the government. This is what he explained to the people. Like, this is in the document. This is what's been included. This is the language, and here's why. The people have the final authority, and they can do what they please. Here's Mike Meharry talking about this we the people as well. He says, have you ever stopped to think about why it says we the people? He says it's actually significant. When an 18th century British king issued a grant, his name always appeared at the top of in the same fashion, not we the people. The framers, it could have said king and parliament maybe. The framers of the Constitution merely replaced the king's name with we the people, signifying the sovereign authority from which the delegation of power flowed. In other words, all authority in the United States ultimately flows from the people, not the government. It's a reaffirmation of sovereignty, which was a huge change. No government before that in history really was based on the sovereignty of the people. It was a king, a queen, a cabal. In essence, how the people treat government today. We wait for government to give us permission to be free. We wait for permission slips to exercise our rights. We beg at the trough for handouts, when it really is supposed to be the other way around. They tell us that it's power to the people. We heard that old kind of anti-war phrase, maybe activism phrase from decades past. You hear it sometimes today, but it's really backwards. It's supposed to be power from the people. We're not begging for power. We, the people, have to learn how to assert it. Anyways, Mike says, in the British system, the king in Parliament was sovereign. In practice, Parliament exercised ultimate authority, with the king serving as the arm to put its power into action. And he goes further. He says, but we the people does not mean the whole people, like one kind of united blob of people, or every, and he says that as well, or every person in America taken together as a giant glob. It would be more accurate to say we the people of the states. And he says, in fact, as originally drafted, the preamble listed every state. And he answers the question, he asked this, so why did the committee change it to simply we the people? And a lot of people have taken this view. It's kind of we're basing it on an assumption. Because, he says, there was no guarantee that every state would ratify. Say, for example, Rhode Island decided to not join the Union, or North Carolina, for example, decided. And then you had we the people of the states of Rhode Island, North Carolina, etc., and then they don't ratify, how can you include that? So once it's ratified, this is not something, it's not a digital document that can just be edited. It's talking about a printing process, shipping, mailing, all that stuff. And that's one of the reasons that most people are assuming, and I'm going to go again, this is an assumption. Mike says it would have made no sense to have it listed if Rhode Island didn't ratify. The change in style was for that purpose, not a reflection of a change in how the framers viewed sovereignty. And in fact, Tench Coxe actually discussed this very notion. This is a long set of quotes that I want to highlight here, talking about how you can say we the people, but what you're meaning is not we the people of the several of one just kind of consolidated government, but of a union of states. And this was writing as a freeman. He wrote a series of papers in support of the Constitution under the pen name or pseudonym of Freeman. This is January 1788. He says, though the convention proposes that it should be an act of the people, it is in their capacities as citizens of the several members of our confederacy. So Coxe, when he's arguing in favor of ratification, is telling the people when they're considering this, if you're concerned about this, we the people, I am on the side of ratification. I'm one of the most well-known people here. You gotta, I mean, maybe they didn't know it was Coxe at the time, but he was very influential in these publications. And this is what we meant by this. It meant the citizens of the several members of our confederacy, for they are expressly declared to be the people of the United States. Now think about it. It's not the United States. We get confused about this. And where do you live? Well, you live in the United States. You think of it as just one country. Everything's going to be exactly the same. But it was the United States. States is plural. So you're talking about a union of various sovereignties, members of the Confederacy. And he says they are expressly declared to be the people of the United States, to which idea the expression is strictly confined. And the general term of America, which is constantly used in speaking of us as a nation, is carefully omitted. A pointed view was evidently had to our existing union. He's really highlighting this. We went out of our way to exclude the word America, thinking of it as one giant country, and instead focusing on the Union, which had already been there. There was a Union under the Articles of Confederation. This was just an expansion of that as well. He says, but we must see at once that the reason of the people being mentioned was that alterations of several constitutions were to be effected, which the convention well knew could be done by no authority but that of the people, either determining themselves in their several states or delegating adequate powers to their state conventions. And again, here's how Coxe sums it up. He says, had the federal convention meant to exclude the idea of union, that is, of several and separate sovereignties joining in a confederacy, they would have said, we the people of America. For union necessarily involves the idea of component states, which complete consolidations exclude. So just the fact that it says, we the people of the United States, we the people, the idea is that, well, this is a union of states. You can't have a union without constituent parts. And that's how he put it. Michael Rappaport, in an article at lawliberty.org, summed it up like this as well. He says, people often forget that the United States was originally understood as a plural noun. The Constitution itself treats it that way, stating in the Treason Clause, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies. So even the Constitution itself says the term or the phrase United States is a plural term. So if you're committing treason against the United States, you're not committing treason against it or the government. It's against these several states of the Union, and then it leaves room to expand it as well. So that isn't really even mentioned much as well, but I think that's an important part to cover as well. Now, talking about, we know these sections of the preamble. I'm going to briefly go through these sections or purposes. We already know that we, the people, was really about asserting sovereignty. That means the people are the top of the food chain. And here back to Nadelson, he says, the preamble tells us that the rest of the document ordains the delegation of power to a new political system established under the Constitution. And then we have these 6 goals. 1, to render an existing union more perfect. He points out that most people think that this means a better union. But in 18th century language, perfect usually meant complete. The goal there was to tighten things up, make a more complete union than that was created by the Articles of Confederation, where one state, for example, Rhode Island or New York or Virginia, was able to veto an amendment to the Articles of Confederation, and then they were concerned that that was going to create a problem, and they had many problems under that. Number 2, to establish justice. This was a core value in the founders' political philosophy, which was government impartiality. And under the Articles of Confederation, they felt that a number of states were acting unjustly towards each other. And this was to create kind of a uniform form of justice. To ensure domestic tranquility. We know that there was not a lot of tranquility. There also wasn't. So even though the goal was that, we had Shays' Rebellion in 1786. We had some Northwest Indian Wars that started before ratification of the Constitution. Unfortunately, there was more stuff that happened after as well. But this is one of the goals, to ensure domestic tranquility. Peace was incredibly important to the founding generation. Thomas Jefferson, years later, of course, said, as to myself, I love peace. Didn't even hold back. To provide for the common defense, which, of course, this was to make sure that you could defend all of the constituent parts. To promote the general welfare, which a lot of people think means to do whatever the government wants. This isn't even the general welfare clause in Article 1, Section 8. And Rob puts it this way: this has nothing to do with the modern welfare state, which nearly all the founders would have opposed. General is a synonym for common or universal. So that means it's referring to all Americans as opposed to particular individuals, regions, or interests. And welfare was meant at the time human happiness and flourishing. So general welfare, this is not Article 1, Section 8. It's just saying universal happiness and flourishing. They're promoting that, not guaranteeing it, not handing it out, but creating an environment of promoting that. And we know through their experience that centralized consolidated power destroyed that. It treated people individually in regional or political interests, and it did not develop happiness and flourishing. And of course, part of the reason that the American Revolution existed, if not the primary reason that they separated from Great Britain, was because the Parliament claimed power over the people of the colonies in all cases whatsoever. You couldn't be more consolidated and centralized than that. And then, of course, to secure the blessings of liberty, Rob says this reflects another of the founders' core political values, which is freedom. Closing it out here from congress.gov. I feel weird saying that, but this is really good stuff. They say there is no historical evidence, none whatsoever. There is none anywhere, not in the articles supporting or opposing ratification, not in the Philadelphia Convention, not in the state ratification dates, that the framers conceived of a preamble with any substantive legal effect, such as granting power to the new government or conferring rights to those subject to the federal government. So people who say, well, it says here general welfare in the preamble, even here at congress.gov, Congress's own website, they're not claiming that they get new power from the preamble. Of course, they'll claim all kinds of power from other things, but even there, they're saying the preamble grants no new power. Instead, they write, the founding generation appeared to view the Constitution's prefatory text. Sorry, I get a lot of these words from reading, so sometimes saying them out loud for the first time is a little weird. Prefatory text is generally providing the foundation for the text that followed. That's just how James Madison described it in his report of 1800. In doing so, the preamble ultimately reflects 3 critical understandings that the framers had about the Constitution. So it is there. It gives us awareness of 3 foundational principles. First, with its conclusion that, quote, this Constitution was established for ourselves and for our posterity, it made very clear that unlike other constitutions in Great Britain or most of the rest of the world all through history, that this was a written constitution. This is a distinctly American innovation, something that came out of the founders and old revolutionaries, and that one that many in that generation considered to be their greatest contribution to the science of government, if we want to point that out. So this was a written Constitution, first of all. Second, it had 6 broad purposes as to why they even did this. Why did they do this? And it was grounded heavily in their historical experience under the Articles of Confederation and even before that. And finally, and I think most importantly, we go back to that we the people. It reaffirms that sovereignty, final authority comes from the people, or as Tench Coxe said, from the people of the several states. And of course, that has the distinct and clear implication that we the people remain ultimately responsible for the proper interpretation and application of what is, in the end, our Constitution, not theirs. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope you learned something. I'm running a little bit long today, so I will look over in the live chat and the archive comments a little bit later today, see if there's any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes that I can reply to. Of course, if you like the show, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, smashing the like button, leaving comments on places like Facebook, YouTube, and elsewhere, all those types of things that triggers the algorithm of the platform you watch or listen on, and it tells that platform to show the program to more people. Of course, don't forget about all these other platforms we're on, Minds and Gab and the Podcast Edition and Brighteon and Odyssey.com and elsewhere. I will publish 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all the show notes with the links to the stuff that I referenced today, sometime in the next hour or so, once I'm done here in just a moment or so. And of course, don't forget our membership program. If you are able to do it, please don't feel any obligation to. And I want to express my complete and utter, total gratitude to those of you who are putting your financial faith behind our work, whether it's $2 or a few $100s a month or on an annual basis. If you're able to join in with them and help us out, I would be extremely grateful for your support. It starts out as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. If you've got questions, let me know. Leave it in the comments or email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I hope you had a great weekend and your Monday's off to a good start, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.